backed off as soon as the first excuse came to mind.
We've been supporting ISIS in Jordan, in Turkey, through our proxies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There is absolute continuity between the policies of Iraq and breaking it up and breaking up Syria as well. It is beyond naive to suggest that the U.S. doesn't have its fingerprints all over ISIS. In fact, tell me this, why has ISIS never once, or al-Nusra Front or al-Qaeda, not once have they attacked Israel? In fact, ISIS militants are getting medical attention in the Golan Heights and in Israel itself. What does that tell you? There is absolute continuity, but the actual policy, just like the Project for a New American Century laid out very clearly, that a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would be necessary to achieve this goal of full spectrum dominance. You could never tell the American people, or the world for that matter, we're going to fight wars of aggression where we're going to have to invade and occupy, we're going to have to spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to achieve the goal of full spectrum dominance, which is to control, absolute control over air, land, sea, and space, and cyberspace. The American people never would have bought it, so you can't tell them that. You have to tell them a bunch of lies. Now, ISIS, funny enough, could stand for the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. Many people are seeing the very big benefits to the State of Israel, the so-called Jewish State of Israel.
To crosstalk the Islamic State, I'm joined by my guest, Majdi Rafizadeh in Los Angeles. He is a Harvard scholar and president of the International American Council on the Middle East. In London, we have Ken O'Keefe. He is a political analyst and ex-U.S. Marine who renounced U.S. citizenship. And in New York, we cross to Peter Van Buren. He is a veteran of the U.S. State Department who served in Iraq and is also author of We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. All right, crosstalk rules in effect, gentlemen. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Peter, if I go to you first in New York, I think most people would say the war on terror, i.e. from George Bush, didn't work out too well, if I can put it that way. And, you know, we had Obama wanting to end these stupid wars, and now, go up to the present, to this year, we have the war on terror 2.0. Well, if the first one didn't work out too well, why are we going to try it again? Go ahead.
Well, there seems to be a pattern in Washington where when something doesn't work out, the answer is to do it again, but do it more violently at a higher cost with, albeit better, technology. There seems to be no emphasis on results, simply on the process. I think Washington has simply run out of ideas, run out of strategies, and in the midst of a fury to do something, just repeats the mistakes of the past. Look, if you're standing in front of a burning house and the only option you feel available is to throw a can of gasoline in the house, it is better, in fact, to do nothing.
Okay, Majdi in Los Angeles. I mean, when we're looking at and going after the Islamic State here to degrade and destroy, is the U.S. strategy, you know, is it the appropriate one? Because, you know, we tried destroying, bombing extremists into oblivion, and it didn't work. As a matter of fact, it got a whole lot more blowback and far more extremists on the ground. I mean, why is the strategy being pursued against the Islamic State?
I think you're absolutely correct. I believe there is a structural problem in the U.S. foreign policy, and this is not just limited to Obama administration, the previous administration as well, that the short-term interests or the immediate interests override the long-term interests. And that's what you're seeing that's happening repeatedly. If we look at the U.S. history involvement in the Middle East, particularly, there have been a lot of mistakes done, for instance, that resulted into substantial, egregious, unintended consequences. In the 1980s, U.S. Arming and financing Mujahideen, which came back home to roost in 9/11. Then we have U.S.-led overthrow of Gaddafi, which opened the field for Al-Qaeda affiliated group to operate there. And now we have U.S.-led airstrike against the Islamic State, which does not really have any kind of articulate agenda or strategic goal that one can clearly witnessed. So you can see all these,
there is something
I think,
articulate
inefficient
here.
policies.
I think there is something very articulate. If I can go to Ken in London here, this is exactly what the Islamic State wants. They want the United States to bomb them. They want to be the magnet for recruitment. If you just, even a cursory review of mainstream media, the number of people that are going there to fight their jihad or whatever they want to do, this is a magnet here. And what is very interesting here is more unintended consequences. I don't think the Islamic State really cares about that, but it wants the U.S. and its allies to trip into more blunders, and that means creating nonstop, perpetual war in the Middle East.
Well, I'm going to make this interesting and disagree with everyone.
Okay.
I do not accept the premise, which probably isn't too much of a surprise, but nonetheless, I reject the premise that the whole point of the so-called war on terror or investing in the Mujahideen was to somehow fight terrorism or to make a better world. I would argue that if you really want to know what's happening with Middle Eastern policy, then you must read Oded Yanan's A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. Now, in that document, which is pretty much being played out to a T right now and has been for many years, there were serious objectives for Israel. And Israel's main objectives were to expand and grow in line with the Greater Israel Project. And in order for it to do that, there would need to be an excuse to justify the expansion of Israel, and in order to do that, we would have to sow the seeds of sectarian hatred and violence in the region. The #1 target of this plan was Iraq. We've achieved that. That's not a failure. That's actually a success. Iraq is a failed state largely. It is an absolute basket case. Sectarian hatred is absolutely insane. We see the beheadings and all of this madness, and we think it's a disaster. No, it's not at all. In fact, it's all part of the plan to break up Iraq into 3 different states. When we look at Syria, we also find that the goal is once again the same thing: sow the seeds of sectarian hatred and basically turn that nation into a basket case. This is happening according to plan as well. Now, ISIS, funny enough, could stand for the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. Many people are seeing the very big benefits to the state of Israel, the so-called Jewish state of Israel, by the breakup and the balkanization of the surrounding states. So actually, if you believe what's being told to you, and I just don't know why anyone would believe anything that comes out of the mouth of virtually any Western leader, whether it be Obama or Bush or any of the rest of them, all of these people are nothing but patent liars, and everything they say is pretty much the opposite of the truth. So I don't accept virtually anything they say.
Okay, good. Okay, Peter, if I can go to you in New York, I mean, we can make some very good points there. We have this standard regime change, forced regime change around the world. If you want to go to the Middle East all the way to Ukraine here, and I think Ken's onto something there, because for the Middle East, it's not regime change, it's region change. It's to reorder the region completely through sectarian differences. Yes, it does probably benefit, or very clearly benefits, Israel here, but this is more the unintended consequences. You can turn the apple cart upside down, but you can't control, where all the apples go, if I can use the analogy. Go ahead, Peter.
I would almost feel better in a somewhat ironic way if Ken's statements were borne out, that there was some type of global strategy behind all this. What I see instead is the creation of chaos largely by a chaotic American foreign policy. It's been said many times that war is simply an extension of policy by other means. And if there is no coherent policy behind that war, then the wars will simply be chaotic violence. Barack Obama did not bite at the opportunity to get involved in Syria a year ago. In fact, at the time when he was ready to start bombing Assad just about 13 months ago, he backed off as soon as the first excuse came to mind.
We've been supporting ISIS in Jordan, in Turkey, through our proxies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There is absolute continuity between the policies of Iraq and breaking it up and breaking up Syria as well. It is beyond naive to suggest that the U.S. doesn't have its fingerprints all over ISIS. In fact, tell me this: why has ISIS never once, or al-Nusra Front or al-Qaeda, not once have they attacked Israel? In fact, ISIS militants are getting medical attention in the Golan Heights and in Israel itself. What does that tell you? There is absolute continuity, but the actual policy, just like the Project for a New American Century laid out very clearly, that a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would be necessary to achieve this goal of full spectrum dominance, you could never tell the American people, or the world for that matter, we're going to fight wars of aggression where we're going to have to invade and occupy, we're going to have to spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to achieve the goal of full spectrum dominance, which is to control, absolute control over air, land, sea, and space and cyberspace. The American people never would have bought it, so you can't tell them that. You have to tell them a bunch of lies. And we see this over and over again.
What you have to do, Ken, if I can go... Okay, Peter, I'll let you reply, but I think one thing is for sure is that just keep people scared, really, really scared, and then they follow. They'll follow you no matter what you say. Just show those beheadings. Something must be done. Sometimes, as Peter said earlier, maybe nothing should be done. Peter, you want to reply to what Ken had to say in London? Go ahead.
Well, a couple of points. First is first of all, you'd have to probably waterboard me to try to get me to make a statement in favor of what the United States has done in the Middle East. That's certainly not the point I'm maintaining, and I certainly agree with Ken that America's hands are all over ISIS. It seems to be, however, an application of Occam's razor, if you will. The simplest explanation is often the current one. The United States invasion in 2003 in Iraq was certainly not designed, and I was there, to break Iraq up into statelets. It was designed to create a client state for the United States in Iraq, and it was necessary to hold the disparate elements together to make that client state as big and as powerful as possible. But I think the thing we all do agree on here is the fear-mongering. I took a look as part of a different project that I'm working on at U.S. propaganda towards the Japanese at the end of World War II. And in fact, word for word, it was almost identical to what our mass media is pushing out today as propaganda. The United States at the end of World War II was using the term holy war to describe the fanatical Japanese who fought simply on the side of their emperor. If you substitute Allah and Islam for emperor, it all tracks. You could simply change the visuals. In fact, you don't even need to alter the visuals. Those documentaries had beheadings in them.
Let me jump in here because I want to go back to our guests in Los Angeles before we go to the break. A lot of people will say that the war on terror 2.0 is actually a war on Islam. How do you respond to that, Majdi, in Los Angeles?
I don't think it's completely would be characterized as a war on Islam. You can see evidences of what the administration is saying, that it's a war on radical Islam or the extremist group. But the fact is that this extremist group emerged as a consequences of, as a result of the inefficient Western interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East, and particularly after the invasion of Iraq. So I don't really broaden it in a picture that
gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Islamic State. Stay with our team. Okay, I'd like to go back to Ken in London. I find the existence of ISIS, it's being revealed slowly but surely, and I'm going to agree with some comments that you made. I mean, it's almost been midwifed, if I can use a term the administration likes in its foreign policy. And essentially, its first goal is to destroy the state of Syria. That's it. I mean, if we look, we see the strikes that are being made. They're against ISIS, but they're against infrastructure. I mean, a granary doesn't threaten the world. It doesn't threaten anyone. Actually, it feeds people. But somehow that is a terrorist asset that must be destroyed. I find the existence and the midwifing of ISIS to be so very convenient for a number of people.
Well, there's simply no question that there must always be a boogeyman. In fact, you're sitting in Russia now. For 50 years plus, we were fighting this Cold War that really was an absolute charade to begin with. There never really was a threat of a Soviet invasion. And for decades, we spent insane amounts of money developing nuclear weapons to the point of really completely, totally collective insanity. And here we sit today in a world that threatens a third world war with a policy that is clearly intended to totally destroy Syria. Let's see what happens. If we take Bashar al-Assad out of the equation in Syria, does anybody with half a brain not understand that that vacuum that's going to be created is going to be a vacuum filled by the most powerful interests there? And who is that right now? Well, that would be our best friends and allies, these little Frankenstein monsters that we create, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra Front or the latest ISIS monster that we've created. Those are the ones that are going to fill that vacuum, and that fits perfectly in line with Oded Yanan's A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And if these other two gentlemen haven't read that document, I seriously suggest you do. Another thing that's really worthy of pointing out is the so-called Islamic State is anything but Islamic. And yes, there is a war on Islam. Islam is very understood by many Muslims around the world to be absolutely 100% forbidden for you to forcibly convert somebody to Islam or kill them. This is totally untrue. Back in the medieval times, when there was Muslim empires, it was an absolute understanding and policy amongst the Muslims who were in charge at that time that those who practiced whatever religion were allowed to continue practicing that religion, and they were not even forced to pay taxes into the Muslim empire itself. However, if people wanted to practice that religion, they would not be able to derive the benefits of the tax system and so on and so forth. The bottom line is no Muslim in their right mind would justify going in and literally executing men, women, and children simply because they don't convert to your religion. These people are not Islamic. They are creations of the monster, which is the empire of the United States and all its cohorts in Israel and England in particular. And this monster is purposely created to justify the continuing insanity of the never-ending war policy, which is really the core of America. And that is exactly why I renounce my U.S. citizenship. This madness cannot be considered anything but the major threat to the world.
Okay, Peter, in New York, one of the things we've seen, again, in reference to this war on terror, is that, you know, whatever group you in power, I don't care what label you put on it, it's hard to turn them off. And this is what I worry about, is that I agree what we heard. I mean, if Assad goes, I mean, what makes you think it's going to be better? I've never understood that argument here. But, you know, you have to look at the Saudis and the Gulf countries that have been feeding this quote-unquote monster. I like that word. How do you turn this, you know, you turn off the money? I don't see that happening. I don't see that Saudi Arabia has any interest in pursuing an American agenda. It pursues its own interest. And that can be applied to Israel as well. What I worry about is that, you know, it just continues to unseat and destroy everything that is stable in the Middle East. Not that I'm, you know, would be unhappy to see the Saudi regime go.
You know, you've hit on the exact point. If you want to look at Syria's future, all you have to do is glance over at what happened in Libya.
Yeah.
The United States removed one regime and replaced it with essentially nothing. It created a power vacuum that resulted in Benghazi, resulted in the flow of arms all across northern Africa and into Syria as well. As far as the Saudis, and we see it most clearly these days with the Turks, the United States horribly fails to understand that each of these countries has its own interests. Some of those interests overlap with what the United States is trying to do. Take a look at the fact that America is now acting as Iran's air force on the ground in Iraq. But we don't understand the difference between occasional overlapping interests and the broader strategic goals. That is what bites us in the rear end every single time in the Middle East, and I shake my head watching it unfold in front of us today in both Syria and Iraq, and I wonder what will happen next. Which will be the next domino, to use a phrase from the Vietnam War era,
extremely generous to these psychopaths who are running the world right now,
okay,
to say that they're just making mistakes.
Okay, I agree, Ken. Let me go to Los Angeles here.
I try to be polite.
Okay,
it's a family show.
Okay, let's go to Los Angeles here. We heard about the United States functioning essentially as Iran's air force in dealing with ISIS. How do you feel about that? Because, you know, the Americans just have this thing with Iran, you know, and they just can't let it go. They can't let it go. This is an opportunity to change history. Do you think there's going to be any smarts in Washington to say, look, we can work with these people. They have a commitment to see this ISIS be put under control, degraded, and destroyed. Do you think the Americans will ever get to the point and say, yes, we can work with the Iranians? We know they are, but they won't be honest with us.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of contradictions when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, particularly, for instance, the arms embargo, which doesn't have to do anything with the nuclear issue. And if you want Iran to really, Iran is the only country that you can see in the Middle East that is fighting with the Islamic State, putting troops on the ground. So if you want this country to fight really with the Islamic State, so why do you impose other arms embargo on the country? So there are a lot of, I think, contradictions. But if I can add a point just to what your guest said, I agree that there is some kind of effort to demonize Islam, but I think the war is really more on resources and it's more geopolitics, and whatever is really furthering U.S. national interest, that's what the administration would follow, because you see the administration is ally with, I mean, some of the most powerful Muslim Islamic governments in the region. So I think there is an effort to demonize Islam in the mainstream media, particularly in the Western media. But when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, Western foreign policy, it's been always what is in their national interest rather than the interest of the people in the region. And you can see now the airstrike, the coalition airstrike is really hurting mostly the civilians on the ground. The number of refugees has increased, and this is several civilians have been killed, and what they call unintended consequences of the war. And these are already reported in Reuters news agency. So it's I think at the end of the day, are Syrian people who are really suffering in the middle.
Okay, Ken, where do we go from here? Because from Washington and Langley, it just it probably looks like a computer game with their drones and all of that there. But I mean, to what extent? What I'm thinking about is the ultimate regime change, and that's going to be the Gulf countries here, because you can't turn these people off. They have their arms. It's remarkable. Everybody in this conflict has the same arms. Everybody's buying them from one or a few countries here. I mean, this is a really closed network here. But the Saudis better be worried, because they're creating something that's going to go after them, because a lot of people say that they don't represent Islam. It's no mistake in my mind that the Islamic State calls itself the Islamic State, because Saudi Arabia doesn't live up to its reputation. Go ahead.
Well, there are very obvious solutions. One is to arrest the traitors in the U.S. Congress and White House who have sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution, and somehow the American people have sat by while the president has afforded himself the power to execute anyone, anywhere, anytime, for any American citizen to be detained without any due process of law, no representation, incognito, and theoretically he could be condemned to death by a military tribunal in secret and executed. All of this operating under supposedly the United States Constitution. So all of these traitors need to be arrested first and foremost. When Netanyahu came to the Congress a couple years back, he received 29 standing ovations by these cowardly chicken hawk traitors. So the American patriots need to stand up and grab a pair and ultimately have some integrity and get rid of these traitors. Secondly, cut off all funding to Israel. Israel is a pariah state, a criminal state. It is committing active policies of genocide by the legal definition of the word according to Black's Law Dictionary. That country needs to be cut off right now. All of their attention needs to turn inward. Stop your little empire endeavors and full spectrum dominance and all of this sort of madness. Start taking care of your infrastructure back home. Start taking care of the American citizens who have worked their whole lives and now find themselves wondering how they're going to keep a roof over their head. All of that is very obvious and very sensible. Or America can continue to decline into an absolute total pariah state, hated and resented around the world, and maybe bring the whole world into World War III. I would prefer that we do the former instead of the latter, but ultimately we need some serious change in government, and that means getting rid of these traitors.
Okay, Majid, what's it going to take in Los Angeles? What's it going to take for the United States to change its foreign policy? Because I think all of us here have agreed that it's not making any kind of progress. It keeps repeating the same mistakes over and over again with the wrong array of allies.
Well, I don't think, the military and the corporations' interests are so embedded in U.S. Foreign policy that I'm not really optimistic that it's going to fundamentally change. But I will have to add one thing to what your guest said. I think what should be done is also stop, I think, supporting countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and being allied with these countries, which are one of the major factor in emergence of the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, or other.
I got 20 seconds left. I want to go to Peter in New York.
Groups. So,
Peter, I want to give you the last 20 seconds. Go ahead, in New York.
The way to solve the problems in the Middle East are through regime change. The way I differ is that the regime change should take place in Washington, not somewhere else.
Excellent ending to this program. Thanks to my guests here in Los Angeles, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk News.